Welcome to Tomorrow's People, the podcast brought to you by Personio and me, Perry Timms. Everything starts with people. Everything also starts at conferences. So my next guest on this podcast was a speaker at a conference that I was at, and it was the early days of social media adoption. Sharon Tan was an employment lawyer who was talking about what employers and employees need to be wary of when it comes to social media. 2012, we now turn 10 years later plus, and Sharon and I are still in contact, and Sharon's my next guest on the podcast. So we're going to cover an enormous amount of interesting things around the world that's evolved since those 10 years. Let's get straight into it. Welcome, Sharon Tan.
Perry, thank you so much for that, and a pleasure to be with you today.
Pleasure's all mine, believe me. So we have kept in touch throughout those 10 years, and it's lovely. And of course, you've gone through some changes. You've got now little family and all sorts of other things. So congratulations on that. Now, you're employment lawyer at Mishcon de Reya. And so when I knew you were an employment lawyer. You're still an employment lawyer now. But anything in particular about the Sharon Tan journey that kind of got you into where you are now? What's the kind of things that almost like sparked you into the action to be the Sharon Tan we now see?
Very good question. I don't know. I mean, I think that the thing that's always interested me, as you say, about employment law is people. Mm-hmm. The law is, fascinating to lawyers, but can be a bit dry. But people are the one thing that both they're a constant and they're always changing. Yeah. Every person is different. Every situation is different, and that's the one thing that really keeps me interested and has kept me engaged over not just a decade, but possibly two.
Wow.
High time flies. Nice. But whether it's litigation, M&A, just dealing with the day-to-day HR issues, people are absolutely at the heart and centre of both businesses and everything. Brilliant. That both you and I do.
Brilliant. And it is nice because our professional fields are regularly in collaboration, sometimes in a way that is where it's tense and there's a legality and there's a standoff and a decision to be made, but not always. Sometimes there are ways that HR professionals and employment lawyers are coming together to stop that kind of thing from happening even in the first place. And when we were talking before recording, we were touching on that's a continuation that you see. So do you see that the, preventative nature is as much a part of being an employment lawyer as helping people with the interpretation of law in making a decision?
Absolutely. There's just no question about it. I mean, the law is just the framework that sits behind it. I always take the view that, everybody's business is their business to run. My job largely is to help them to manage their risk. Yeah. And just to try and get in front of the problem to the extent that we're able to. Sometimes that's not possible. Yeah. But to the extent it is always better to try and take a proactive approach and try and head things off at the pass. Yeah. And, that's ideally what you will be doing.
Yeah. I guess if we look at the world now compared to 10 years ago, it was complex then. It's even more complex now. What are some of the things and themes that we can talk about where you are occupying your time with clients and helping them out and so on? I mean, there's probably a range. Let's start somewhere.
Well, I mean, I guess one of the things that everybody has been grappling with, and it may be obvious, but it's certainly one thing that clients are still talking about a lot. And I mean, it's a business we're still dealing with as well, is the whole business of, the hybrid working, flexible working arrangements. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that it's one of the biggest societal changes I think we've seen, certainly in the workplace over our working careers in this generation. And it's undoubtedly one of the lasting legacies of the pandemic in the workplace. And I mean, really, it has an awful lot to be said for it and an awful lot to recommend it. I think once we all sort of, got over the fact that we were all stuck in our living rooms or whatever it was, looking at everybody else stuck in theirs and figured out how to make things work, we then realised that, when you take the pandemic out of it, there's a lot that's actually really beneficial, and it allows a lot of people to better manage their work-life balance, to juggle all of the various competing demands they have, and a happier workforce tends to be a more productive workforce. So I mean, I think the issues, just coming back to your question, but the issues that a lot of my clients and a lot of employers, as I say, are grappling with is this business of how to find the perfect balance, how to find the happy medium, because there are so many situations in which the employer wants a little bit more presence in the office, the employee wants a bit more work-life balance at home, and, you've got a whole range of situations. I think that some research was done quite recently which suggested that I think 90% of employers are now operating a hybrid working model of some variety, but I think about 67% of HR directors are struggling to get people back into the office to the extent that they would like. ideally. So, on the employer side of things, it's like, I want more engagement. I want to build a culture. I mean, all very laudable, all really sensible. Often I want, more touch points with clients. I want those serendipitous moments by the water cooler. And the employee, it's not to say that they're not up for that, but it's finding the right balance, I think, in between the two.
Yeah, certainly when I'm talking to clients, same sort of thing, right? And a few of them are exploring how duty of care, for example, is impacted on. So a few have said to me, but what about things like screen assessments and workstations?
Absolutely.
And they are genuinely starting from that point of, I want to look after my people, but they're also thinking, if it went to a litigious claim about the fact that the work they did for me led to them having a bad back because they had a bad workstation, I don't want to get into that legal stat. Are you seeing any of that coming through?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We are.
Right.
I mean, and I think the point to make there is that when it comes to health and safety, duty of care, you're absolutely right. The fact that somebody is working remotely does not mean that you are excused of that. And I think that, that's something that for SMEs in particular, I think it's just worth bearing in mind, because there is a real upside from the employer's perspective too of a lack of overhead. So you can say, do you know what, we're going to go fully remote. And a lot of people are. It's, a fantastic retention recruitment tool, no question, in some circumstances. And some people, frankly, are coming to job interviews saying, I'm a fantastic candidate, I'd love to do it, but only if it's fully remote. So, that is great and it can work. But you're absolutely right to say that, you need to balance on the one hand, the saving of overheads, saving of office costs, with the fact that your tech needs to work better, with the fact that, your health and safety obligations remain in place and you might need workplace or workstation assessments in the usual way. You've got, confidentiality issues, you've got GDPR issues, data protection. There's a whole host of issues that do make this arrangement a little bit more complex, completely surmountable, but absolutely one of those things that ideally you should be thinking about and managing proactively to prevent issues.
I find it really nice that you led with things like connectedness and serendipity and the feel of culture and so on. And you're absolutely right. I think there are lots of people who have endured working from home and are longing to go back. And one of the things and the dilemmas, I guess, we're talking about is companies are saying, but it's kind of slower to do certain things because my day is just rammed with appointments. I mean, I'm guessing as an in-demand advisor and lawyer, you're the same. You're dealing with a pretty relentless workload. In your practice, I mean, how are you kind of navigating around that as a group of lawyers who have got their own clients, but equally you're, looking after yourselves as well? I mean, the kind of conversations you're having are the same as the conversations your clients are having, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we're a business like every other business, and it's really interesting. I think in some ways it makes you a much more empathetic and understanding advisor if you've kind of lived it or tried to live it as much as you can. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that one of the biggest challenges that we have, with the working environments that we have and the challenges that we have, is to find ways to establish the boundaries, not just for ourselves, but for our people. Because, on the one hand, you have, the ability for people to work the extra hour at the front end of the day and at the end of the day, but that can lead to burnout. And, the boundaries between the personal and the private life really do get blurred because you just go upstairs, you just go down, I'll just work a little bit longer. And so I think, there is something to be said for, how do you manage that? Do we need to get to a point such as, France and Portugal have of saying there is enforced downtime? People actually have the right to turn their iPhones, God forbid, off and become not connected, to not be social, going back a decade to when we first met. But I think these are all the kind of issues and topics that are evolving as we move forward.
And I guess you're finding yourself in a position where the law isn't quite yet there yet in terms of prescriptive. So you are having to be interpretive, aware of the law and the parameter, but also aware, as you said, of business context and people's needs. Do you find yourself more in that sort of almost liminal space?
What you mean in terms of how you manage the kind of the overlap between the legalities of it and finding... We do. And one of the things I think really that's cropped up in that space of late is the business of pay. I mean, pay is always at the heart of these things. But, we've had a lot of discussions with clients and there's been, various articles in the press, including with some law firms, about what you do in circumstances where somebody isn't going to be in the office full time or is only coming in once a month or once a week. Because, you obviously see the kind of the carrot side of people trying to entice people into the office. I said earlier that HRDs are struggling to get people in. So you've got you see the advent of, drinks at the end of the day, free meals, all of this sort of thing, the carrot. The stick side we are seeing too, because some people are saying, well, fairness is very important, particularly in London. There used to be the London Waiting Alliance, there still often is. And so people have kind of come to me and said, well, what do we do? These people are not incurring the costs of commuting. They're not, paying to live in zone 1, zone 2, whatever it is. Is it fair? I mean, just genuinely leave the law to one side, but is it fair to those that are incurring those costs that they are paid the same? And so we have seen sort of a rise of people saying, employers saying, in fact, a law firm was in the press not so long ago for saying, we're going to have a 20% reduction in pay for those who want to go fully remote and just come in once a month. And, it's a really interesting question culturally as well as legally. I mean, clearly anything can be done by agreement. And I think the important thing, of course, is to make sure you're not giving something and then seeking to try and take it afterwards, because that doesn't work. But, I mean, it's a really interesting conversation. And I think, it does throw up a whole kind of different train of thought because, traditionally, women were the ones who had the part-time arrangements, more often than not always, and hopefully not to the same degree of prevalence these days. But, there's more of a propensity statistically for women to want a part-time arrangement. And what's interesting, I think, is that the kind of traditional 4-day week that was favoured historically pre-pandemic by a lot of working mothers has sort of morphed into more of a working from home arrangement, and that can be a win-win for everybody. I mean, you're not spending time commuting to the office whenever you can do the school run, you can come back, you can log on, you can do all sorts of things, and it really, really can work. But I think the question when you put it together with what I was just talking about in relation to pay is, you get difficult questions thrown up, such as, is it indirectly discriminatory to have those sorts of arrangements? Because are more women than men likely to be affected? Now, I think my own view on that is that you can probably defend it.
Right.
Because as long as it's not just cost, but there are good reasons for it, and as long as the reduction is proportionate, there are certainly arguments for saying it's not indirect sex discrimination. But equally you could have people saying, well, I need to work from home because I'm disabled. I think that's more difficult because is it a reasonable adjustment? So there's a whole lot of stuff that's thrown up, and that's just in the here and now. I think over the medium term, the long term, what we haven't yet seen is, is there going to be a widening of the gender pay gap? Are we going to find that people who are, much more full-time remote are struggling with career advancement? So, a lot of these things coming up.
You're right. We're at the very beginning of a lot of this unravelling, right? And as ever, and I don't expect it to be otherwise, the law kind of has to have precedence before it can start to form into place for some of this, right?
Yeah, I mean, often this stuff is dealt with via case law, not by Parliament. They're somewhat busy at the moment. A lot of the employment law stuff has sort of been sitting somewhat on the back burner for a while. So,
I noticed. IR 35 in out, all sorts of things, right? So, so I think we can agree that there's more to come. But I'm liking what I'm hearing from you, which is really a very practical sense in many ways, starting with fairness as well as legality becoming part of that, I don't know, I suppose you'd say proving concept. So we don't want to panic, but we've got to be alive to what's going on now in terms of what the long tail implications of it are, I suppose. And pay is so sensitive to people, obviously, cost of living crisis and so on, more so. So we've been talking on this podcast to people in talent acquisition and in sustainability and the green sort of futures. And the message is coming through pretty strongly that purpose matters. People are willing to trade time and flexibility and ethical employers for certain different elements of pay and conditions and so on. So I think we're sort of starting to go beyond a little bit the contract, if that makes sense. And I don't know whether that, again, gives you a sense of the different relationship between HR professionals and lawyers going into that sort of arrangement. Ethical employers, transparency, purposeful.
Yeah.
That kind of thing perhaps opens up a different way to offer protection and the risk management that you talked about with clients. I mean, just thinking about people who publish the salaries of everybody in the company quite openly. I mean, it's a very moving feast, isn't it?
It really is. And you're absolutely right to say that, I suppose not even a generation ago, not that long ago, the demarcation between private life, what people cared about in terms of the causes they would support, and the professional life were really very distinct. That line has, I think, become very blurred. And I think with the advent of Generation Z coming into the workplace, it's really kind of escalated. And I think we saw it coming out of the pandemic. We really were pre this funny recessionary space that we're in at the moment, but we came out into a real war on talent. And it's absolutely something that people were looking at. They were taking a much more holistic approach to their career, to what they wanted from their career, and they were very much saying, look, the differentiator for me is how you treat all stakeholders, not just shareholders. And what's really interesting, I suppose, when you overlay the legal system that we have at the moment, is what formally do employers have to put out there? And at the moment, obviously, we've got gender pay gap data, but we don't have ethnicity pay gap reporting, and we're not likely to for the foreseeable future. But and so I suppose employers could say, well, okay, how much can you see from the outset? Is it more of a retention issue rather than a recruitment issue? But again, going back to where we first met, the whole business of social media, we live in a social media obsessed world. And so, be it Glassdoor or whatever it is, there are so many ways that prospective recruits can see into an organisation. And the things that matter, certainly, cash is, comp is certainly used to be king. I think certainly we have seen a bit of a move away from that in recent years. Now, it remains to be seen whether we move straight back into cash is king in difficult recessionary times, because, some of this might be nice to have whenever the chips really are down. But it's a really good observation.
And I guess the whole sense that things like culture matters and companies' stance on social injustice and where people say, but you didn't back me, not directly, but something I'm affiliated with through lived experience or born circumstances, is again an interesting tension, I guess, between employer and employee. It just shows you how the nature of that relationship just shifts with what's big macroeconomic and macro political minor individual stuff. It's just a real mishmash. It's interesting to me how you kind of keep abreast of all of this and then try and make it fit in the way that I guess you are a legal practitioner and an advisor and that kind of thing. You must find yourself having to consume a lot of information.
Oh yeah, I mean undoubtedly I will be the geek on the tube sitting there reading cases. It's just you fit it in where you can fit it in. But it's fascinating. I think as with everything, if you're fascinated by what you do and you love it, it's not so difficult.
And I think there is something about that passion is what we really want to see from our people stepping into the workplace in the way that we described at the beginning of this, where it's all about, the changing nature of expectations and demands and so on, set against a whole different operating paradigm.
This podcast is brought to you by Personio. Personio is the all-in-one HR solution for now and the future. We help HR teams recruit, onboard, manage, pay and develop employees more efficiently, and our easy-to-use solution works across every part of the employee lifecycle. Automate your people processes and gain time back for more impactful work, like creating your people strategy. After all, everything starts with people. To find out what Personio can do for you and your business, head to personio.com. That's PERSONIO.com.
One of the things that I've been surprised about, because I go back to the sort of Margaret Thatcher 1970s, minor disputes and so on, I thought we'd seen the end of industrial action. And then all of a sudden, we are beset, understandably, by a bit of a revolt.
Yeah.
I mean, how's that playing out in your world and clients and just your general perspective on things?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we live in a cyclical economy, and I think it's fair to say that whenever you have these economic tensions, you've got, I mean, goodness, inflation today was hitting 10%, whatever it was year on year. It's frightening. I think that everybody is in a position where, their interests are, polarizing slightly.
Right.
And everybody, there's only so much to go around. And I think, as I say, employers find themselves, SMEs will find themselves in this difficult place, undoubtedly saying, well, how do we manage our cost base? We're coming into a recession. What are we going to do? Our biggest cost in so many businesses is the wage bill every month. What are we going to do about it? And, there are different flavours of this. And it very much plays at the one end of the spectrum to the kind of the black letter of the law and how that all fits together. But at the other, I think there is this business of, how do we solve this problem together? How do you, when you need to pivot in turbulent times, which there is no doubt we are living in at the moment, how do you bring your people with you? One thing that we've seen quite a lot of course, we've seen lots of strikes, and I don't imagine, as you say, we've seen the last of them, albeit often for very understandable reasons. You can see equally from employers, they're not necessarily able to drive their revenue up in a corresponding way, can't necessarily match inflation, and so you have this sort of disconnect. And nobody is in some ways the baddie in many situations. It's just a really difficult situation to reconcile. And one thing that we have seen rise of during the pandemic, particularly I think in the retail and tourism sectors, during the pandemic, was this whole business of fire and rehire. Which is essentially just a legal means at the moment of forcibly changing people's terms and conditions. Now, it's in some ways the inverse of what the unions are pushing for. They're pushing for pay raises, or rises, I should say. But, I suppose looked at from the prism of the employer, the employer's perspective, it's when you need to actually reduce the wage bill a little bit. Now, none of it is necessarily appealing, but it is still technically lawful to fire people on a mass basis often, with a very small redundancy package on offer, and immediately offer them another job on the, albeit slightly less good terms and conditions. And really what you're essentially doing is putting them in an invidious position of being left with a legal claim that's not worth very much because they have been offered an opportunity to fully mitigate their loss. It is lawful, I'm afraid to say, with a few small exceptions, to do that. But, we've seen it in the pandemic. We've seen P&O Ferries was probably one of the worst situations. They didn't comply with their collective consultation obligations. That's an area in which they didn't, there was a technical claim against them, but the publicity was terrible. And the government, candidly, isn't changing it anytime soon. I mean, we had a code of practice that's been mooted that's not in place, but it's pretty toothless. If it comes in its current incarnation, they might allow you to increase the damages and unfair dismissal claim by up to 25%. But it's not that appealing.
No. And I imagine it creates an incredibly soured relationship in some respects. Just at the time when probably, like you started talking about that, you want togetherness and an esprit de corps. And I mean, I do know a story of one organisation faced with, it was in 2008 crash actually. They lost literally half a year's order book in the matter of weeks. And it was a crisis meeting that the CEO brought together. It was a big manufacturing company in the US. And they started to go along the dialogue of how do we get rid of? And the CEO kind of stopped and went, but if we were a family, I know we're not and we're bigger, but if we were a family, we wouldn't make our brother redundant because we didn't have enough food to go around. We would make do and share. He said, I want to see what we can do. And the short version of this story is that he kind of crowdsourced what people could do. Some took early retirement, some took less days, but on the condition that a colleague of theirs with a family didn't have to. And it was a beautiful example, actually, of where people come together. And it'd be nice to think that's a way of doing it, and that there was a kind of legal protection around people to do that. But I mean, I'm talking about an example that showed the way. But for most people, it's so complex. They're trying to do the right thing, and it often is just fraught with big challenges and psychological breaches, and who knows where that might go in terms of recovery and restoration. But I'm with you. It's like it might not be illegal, but it feels pretty stained and tainted, right? But I suppose there is this sense that facing economic hardship, difficulty in recruiting talent and limited pay bills and so on, the whole sense of what can we do might feel a bit lost on people. And if they look to the legal side of things, it's providing protection and risk management, but it isn't providing necessarily direction and assurance. But that doesn't stop people coming to you though saying, Sharon, what can we do? I bet people still having problems that they need some advice from you on.
I mean, if anything, I think, you know, it tends to increase in times of volatility.
Thoughts.
You know, there isn't always a silver bullet.
No.
And as you say, a lot of it really is about choice and about risk management, because, you know, there's a myriad of choices. You know, there's the legal, you know, the hard kind of, you know, legal economic choices. And then coming back to this point we were talking about how people view the organisation and how it looks after stakeholders in bad times as well as good, there is that reputational piece. And there is, you know, who do we want to be? In terms of our persona, our corporate identity. Who are we going to be? What are we going to stand for? I mean, frankly, even if I look at it through a really mercenary lens, you know, how does that feed back to brand? These things can come against you very, very quickly in this day and age. So, I mean, it's a very nuanced decision in some ways. It's not all, and there are occasions when it's black and white and it's like, okay, fine, we're going to take the risk, it's going to cost X and we're going to move on. But there are so many situations where it's not that cut and dried. And really it shouldn't be for the most part. And, you know, really you put people into the equation. We're talking about families, we're talking about a difficult situation. People are struggling to get new jobs. I mean, not to say for 1 second that businesses haven't got the same pressures. It is difficult, all right. But hopefully, you know, as with all things cyclical, we'll be on an upturn again soon.
It feels like the system might be at a breaking point, but you know, often new systems need the old one to break before the new system comes through. I mean, is there a kind of future perspective that you are hopeful and looking toward in the work you do and the people profession and the world of work more generally? I mean, are there a few kind of things you're like hoping and willing into existence to happen?
I don't know. I mean, I think it is just finding a way through for people to have a happier career and you know, professional existence, because and I do think in some ways, whilst, you know, we're in a transitional period and everybody does need to adapt and find, I hate that phrase, the new normal, because we're well beyond it being particularly new, but, you know, finding a way to enable people to achieve in all areas of their life. I've always been a big proponent pre-pandemic just of trying your best to have it all. And okay, it might be a bit of a fallacy, but I do think there are things that we can do to help set ourselves up better for success. You know, lose the bits of the day that really weren't particularly accretive and that weren't really helping. And, you know, sometimes commuting is important because it's important to see people. It's important to make the effort. It doesn't necessarily need to be 5 days a week. No. But yeah, I mean, the hope is that we'll come back into sunnier economic times, you know, having come through this in as decent and fair a way as we can. Move on to the next chapter.
And I do wonder whether some of that is a different type of merger and acquisition. What I'm talking about there is a kind of merger with the communities that businesses operate in and where people live and so on, and choices around that. And the acquisition of those options that you talked about. I mean, I think there's something really difficult to see right now, but you kind of hope that there's some educational twists to this to come through where people can choose career paths. But I think it's incumbent on businesses to focus on their challenges now, but not ignore that long-term possibility that you just talked about, right? Because that's really the sort of power source behind a lot of this. So I'm wondering, you know, do companies come to you and kind of have a strategy and go, look, this is where we want to head, but actually where we're going is quite radical. We don't know the legality of it or whatever. And, you know, can you help us with the steps along the way and make sure that when we get there, we've got everything in place? Do you get to do that kind of co-strategizing with clients?
Sometimes. I mean, it doesn't happen so often, but it's fantastic when it does.
Nice.
And I suppose one area that you do see it in quite a lot, and it chimes with what you were saying about, you know, in some ways what we've just been talking about this difficult fix that we find ourselves in at the moment. But it sort of comes back to the design of things like incentive schemes. So, you know, post-Lehman, and as you say, it takes change arises out of things kind of getting broken first time round. But, coming out of the whole Lehman and the 2008 crash, we had a whole development in the world of incentive plans about what we call malice and clawback. So if things go wrong, you don't get your deferred bonuses. There's a whole world that has spun up coming out of that. And I suppose maybe out of this current situation we're in, we talk about how do you bring people with you? How do you align those interests? Is there more of a conversation to, take the long-term incentive plans that we have, giving people a stake in the company, doing more of a trade? We as a company need to save jobs. We need to save, we need to save, the costs that we're hemorrhaging out every month at the moment if we are to survive. So we are all in it together. How about we trade a little bit of kind of fixed compensation for an equity stake? I mean, it's something that happens, but it hasn't necessarily happened outside of the C-suite as much to date, and ideally you would like perhaps that to be rolled out across, the whole workforce to the extent it hasn't already. You see it at PLC level, but maybe not so much beyond that.
Yeah. Talks to a bit more of that stakeholder capitalism rather than shareholder capitalism. And I'm interested in things like employee ownership, and I'm interested in, the whole cooperative sense. Are you seeing some of those conversations emerging through this, or?
Not so much cooperatives, but in some contexts, yes, but perhaps not ones that would be relevant to this audience.
Okay.
But I entirely agree. Employee ownership is something I think that's really got a lot to be said for it. John Lewis, I suppose, is kind of the historical model that everybody points to. But that alignment of interests is kind of, I suppose, what you should be shooting for in a world where it feels that everything is so polarized and people are so driven apart. Strike action only just further entrenches people. Not saying it's not legitimate, but everybody ends up then digging in, and it's just become horribly legal. You're in the courts getting injunctions, you're doing this, you're doing that. It's horrible. And it's really, it may solve it eventually, but it leaves scars.
Yeah, and I think what I'm kind of constantly thinking back is the nature of your work being more about the protective, risk-managed legal framework of that change rather than the polarised, fixing, fighting thing that happens now. I mean, I'm sure you'd much rather be spending time doing that. Adversarial, I guess, is part of what you have to accept in some respects, but it feels to me like you're always trying to narrow the gap to get to a decision, right?
Yeah.
Oh, Sharon, that's fantastic. You've got my mind going to all sorts of spaces now about a potential future constitutional construct and therefore also psychological and emotional construct, which I really hope comes to bear. Is there anything else you want to leave us with before we sign off for today?
Goodness, I don't know. I mean, I suppose the only other thought that I had whenever we were talking about this, holistic approach is it kind of goes back to work-life balance.
Okay.
And one thing that I have seen cropping up a little bit is the new word for it is quiet quitting.
Oh, that, yeah.
And actually, if you look at it closely, you kind of go, well, this is work to rule as it was. And I think just, I suppose, the observation I would have is that it depends which side of the line you're on, because a lot of contracts don't say you can work 9 a.m. till 5:30 p.m. and you can clock off at 5:31. Most of them will say, and you will work such additional hours as may be required for the proper performance of your duties. True. And so, that doesn't sit very easily against the kind of the current culture, and it's, quite rightly emerging from the pandemic of, I want to actually enjoy my whole life. I want to make sure that there is this balance. That's what a lot of this hybrid stuff speaks to. And I think one thing that is quite interesting is that, if you are on the right side of the line, it's fine. But again, it comes back to this point about that you mentioned about wanting to have so much from, we want people to turn up with passion. And it's not to say they can't have passion between 9 and 5:30 and it clocks off at 5:31. That may be the case. But, most employers, particularly in SMEs, will probably want, 150%. Let's make this into something. Let's grow it. And that sits pretty uneasily, as I say, alongside people who are saying, look, I'm signed up for this and no more. And I think in terms of just the optics of that, it's got quite a different flavour to it, to the historical work to rule, as we call it, which was much more militant, much more, this is my way of, having a bone to pick with my employer. But it's nonetheless, in practical terms, is it that different? So I think there are some interesting conversations and there's some new things that are sort of arising that will be, no doubt, keeping us all busy.
Great point.
For
I mean,
a long time.
It almost felt to me as you described it, I hadn't created this distinction between a kind of, a contractual revolt, if you want to call it that, without breaching it, to I'm imbalanced here and I just want to restore that balance and I'm not going to make a fuss about it. Yet I sort of am in a way. Do you know what I mean? So I think there's something, like you said, the militancy of work to rule that, we use that in quotes, but it felt like it was a very big declaration versus this subtlety.
Which is actually coming from a different place, which might be, do you know what? I go and do a yoga class every, whatever it is, Thursday, Wednesday, whatever at this time, and that's my work-life balance. That's my thing. Or I go and see my kids, or what, completely different place from a militant stand. But in practical terms for the employer, is it that different? Okay, the employee relations side of it is slightly different. The response should be slightly different, but it's, they're interesting things that we'll all have to navigate, I think.
I wonder whether somebody dare put on an engagement survey in the future. Are you quiet quitting? A lot? Do you know what I mean? I just wonder whether we shouldn't even go there. But I think it does raise a question about where are we getting it wrong then, and what can we do to restore that sense of equity, I suppose, in the relationship. And it'll be really interesting to see whether somebody cites I suspected they were quiet quitting, which is why I then invited them to, you know what I mean? It's like,
you never know
where
where
do we
it's
go
gonna
with it? But it's bound to appear in some kind of parody sitcom somewhere as well before that.
It will.
Maybe a new version of The Office.
Oh, God.
Blimey. Sharon, that was amazing. We covered a lot of ground,
We always do, Perry.
Thank you. And it has been really nice to see you in 3D and reconnect and all that kind of thing. I guess it just remains for me to say thank you for doing what you do and standing in the space that you stand and believing in the things that you believe. And I guess the whole essence of this podcast is about tomorrow's people, but that everything starts with people. So I think you've set out some really interesting perspectives and reality of now, and also kind of alluring future possibilities for us. So Sharon, on behalf of everybody involved in this podcast, thank you very much again.
Thank you, Perry. It's been an absolute pleasure.